Hello Year 12 and anyone else who's watching this, political scientists all. Apologies for the slight lateness of this video going up, but still I hope that it's engaging. We left the story talking about the House of Commons and its functions, and we left talking about how they provide government and how the government, the executive, is drawn from the legislature and therefore the two are fused, they are linked. Today's lesson is going to focus on the House of Lords as promised at the end of last lesson, and this shouldn't take us terribly long. So the purpose of today's lesson is it's not just a voiceover PowerPoint, though I guess it kind of functions that way. I'm going to give some input, you're going to make some notes. Sorry, excuse me, just noticed my hair over my ears. And you're going to make some questions as well in areas that you're uncertain on, and we can discuss those later on Thursday, for example. Now, to next lesson tomorrow, as I record this, we will be doing the battling business units, basically how the House of Commons and House of Lords compete in certain areas and what can be done to assuage that competition and to make sense of it, and basically talk about comparisons between the two. And that should take us to the end of Parliament, as it were. Pardon me, though there are other areas to cover as well. So, that being said, let's get to it. Let's get started. It's another one of those films I've watched too many times. It's Hitler, the Rise of Evil, in case anyone's wondering. Here I have the House of Lords. We'll never be royal. That kind of life just ain't for us. Yeah, there it is at the state opening of Parliament, and you can see the grand gold throne upon which Queen Elizabeth is sat. Philip, what are you doing over there? I don't know, Liz. That's my Queen impression. It's good, isn't it? Anyway, yeah, so much the same way as when we're talking about the Commons, we'll talk about various areas of function when it comes to the House of Lords. And the first of these is legislation. You can tell it's House of Lords because of the background. The PowerPoint I've given you doesn't have that transition, so it's fine. It's functions of the House of Lords. They are non-elected. And as a consequence, they can't really provide legitimation of anything. They can't do that because at the end of the day, they're sort of trapped within the confines of the fact that they're unelected, and therefore they cannot provide any consent or support in the same way that the House of Commons can. So the House of Lords never had legitimacy as part of its remit. It was there to advise the monarch on all matters and sort of remained like a vestigial limb as a higher house that no longer had a monarch to advise, as the monarch was no longer in complete control. As the House of Commons gained more and more power, so the House of Lords lost that political power. As part of the Salisbury Convention, note the word convention there, they pretty much can't do anything. The Salisbury Convention is that if something is in the ruling party's manifesto, then the House of Lords will not seek to block anything that's in the manifesto being passed into law. That came in 1945 with the landslide election of the Labour Party. And it essentially meant that the House of Lords would, on their honour, not try to frustrate the elected will of the people. Now, that's not always been historically true. During the Great Reform Act of 1832, they absolutely did try to stop things and had been doing so since 1815. So it's a relatively new idea, but it is still just a convention. Theoretically, the House of Lords could actually vote down a government bill and prevent it being passed. That being said, they can't actually stop bills being passed anymore because the 1911 and 1949 Parliament Acts essentially allows the House of Commons to ignore anything the House of Lords does. As a consequence, you might wonder, well, what, hang on. Thank you. So what is the point of the House of Lords then when it comes to legislation? If they can't stop bills and they can be essentially ignored? Well, first and foremost, it's expertise. People in the House of Lords have been made life peers for a reason. They've been put there for services to the country. Now, in theory, that means they know what they're talking about and they are experts in their field. Unlike an MP, for example, who may get a new brief as a member of government, i.e. being made Minister for Education, for example, Secretary of State for Education, and not having any background in education. Whereas people appointed for services to education, for example, into the House of Lords would have expertise in that area. And therefore, when legislation passes their way, they're going to look at it with an expert's hat on. They can examine this legislation after it's gone through the House of Commons. And if you remember, it goes through readings and then a committee stage and then another reading and then a vote, and then it's passed to the House of Lords, where they have a debate about it and then they have a committee stage of their own. So in theory, anyone who's got a vested interest or an expertise in an area can turn up knowing in advance what's on the agenda and debate what they feel their expertise is. And any member of the House of Lords can propose an amendment to a bill passing through. Now, they can vote on it and the House of Commons can utterly ignore it, but these are experts in their field. And as a consequence, when they propose an amendment, it tends to be on a technical issue rather than a political issue. And it tends to be something that will enrich the bill rather than prevent it being enacted. In many cases, they actually ease its process and make it more likely to stick when it becomes law. In other words, traditionally, the Lords are respected for their expertise. And so when they do things, even though they can be ignored, they tend not to be. Or if the government of the day disagrees with what they come up with, there has to be some form of making it fit and making it work. And they will tend to work around the Lords rather than work without them, if that makes sense. They tend to take these things seriously. And I'll give you some examples later where that was the case. So what? The House of Commons can ignore, but the House of Lords is professional. And as a consequence, their opinions carry weight. In other words, although they can't directly affect legislation, at least not all the time, their influence is such that they are often listened to. And furthermore, it's not always partisan, i.e. voting along party lines. There are no whips in the House of Lords, so a Conservative peer, for example, may disagree with the Conservative government on a point of expertise to do with the bill. He still wants to support, or she still wants to support the government because they're a Conservative, and yet they can see an area where the bill can be enriched, changed, or made better. And so they'll talk to their crossbench colleagues or their Labour colleagues who may have similar expertise, and they will agree between themselves to vote in a particular way and therefore bring things to the government's attention. So you can see how this can be influential without being directly powerful. There we go. So here are some examples which for some reason are really, really delayed, and I apologise. The first of these was the 2008 counter-terrorism bill. It proposed that those suspected of terrorism offences would be held for 42 days without charge to give people time to interrogate them. But 42 days is a long time. That's well over a month. And it was defeated in the House of Lords by 191 votes. The House of Commons had only passed it by a 9-vote majority before this stage. The then Prime Minister, Golden Brown, texture-like sun, decided it wasn't worth risking it and basically dropped the bill. It was not reintroduced. So although the House of Lords can't officially stop legislation, sometimes their opposition can be enough that Prime Ministers might think discretion is the better part of valour. My second example, he says, hoping it turns up, is May's Brexit deal, her EU withdrawal bill, and I will come back to that later. But again, it was on a knife edge. Every time it was defeated in the House of Lords, the big debate was, would Theresa May seek to reintroduce it to the House of Commons to get it back through the House of Lords? Would she take the constitutional step of trying to ignore the House of Lords on these matters when things were so close? Usually when you ignore the House of Lords, there's an obvious majority and it doesn't really matter. More on that. Oh, I've messed it up. But there's always a big but. This one is mine. 1911, 1949 means that House of Lords has no real power. Here's that example I was talking about. Opposition to the Sexual Offences Amendment Act, which essentially allowed homosexual sex to take place with consent from the age of 16. It had been 18 in 2000. Was it 2000? Somewhere around then. It was defeated in the House of Lords by a large margin, but it had passed the House of Commons comfortably. with no real opposition at all. And as a consequence, the government of the day simply said, well, you know what, we're going to pass it anyway, and literally ignored the House of Lords. The bill gained royal assent, it became law, and now it is the age of consent for homosexual sex is 16 and not 18. The House of Lords opposition did literally nothing, but the debate was heard. And I guess if people were really concerned, that would have meant something. But because it passed through the House of Commons so easily, no one was going to stop it in the end. And that was the difference. Theresa, human rights were optional, May, didn't have that amount of backing for a EU withdrawal bill. Therefore, she could have faced a backbench rebellion or an embarrassing vote in the House of Commons, apart from all the ones she did face, which meant that she probably couldn't get away with simply ignoring the House of Lords. The furore would have been terrific. She didn't have the majority required to basically get away with it. So sometimes the House of Lords acts as a brake, and sometimes it can be ignored. There are your two examples right there. The second function it provides, there's only three by the way, is scrutiny. That is, they look at things, and much like the House of Commons, this is done by committee. Now I'm going to have to take my face away for a bit on this one because I've got a nasty suspicion I'm just in the wrong place. Unlike in the House of Commons, just like the House of Commons, these committees are highly respected. They are experts. They are chosen for their expertise in a particular field or area. And unlike the House of Commons, they don't tend to shadow departments or policies, but they follow issues that are important to people. Hang on, my click didn't work. Now it did. There are two different types of committee in the House of Lords. There are permanent and temporary committees. And here is a list of them. You can find it in the textbook, in the page references I gave you on the Show My Homework, which is why I've taken my face away so you can see these. The ones on the left are permanent. They're there permanently. They're there and they're constantly changed in membership so that they can then keep an eye on these areas. There's the European Union. I've grayed that one out because I guess it won't be permanent anymore. The Science and Technology Committee, the International Relations Committee, the Constitution Committee, the Economic Affairs Committee, and the Communications Committee. Each of these are areas of government that they believe are pretty much set in stone. That is, they're always going to be there. Hence why I've grayed out the European Union Committee. I can't imagine it's going to be permanent anymore. And on the right are things that are issues of the day, so to speak. Now, these can last for many years or multiple parliaments, but they're set up to look at a particular area. So there's the Artificial Intelligence Committee, the Citizenship and Civic Engagement Committee, the Intergenerational Fairness and Provision Committee, the Regenerating Seaside Towns Committee, established in 2018 and still running because it's a major issue, the Rural Economy Committee, and the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee that was set up under George Osborne. I mean, it was while he was Chancellor of the Exchequer that it was set up, because he was using secondary legislation a lot, i.e. taking existing legislation and tweaking it in order to effect tax cuts and also spending cuts, which runs several risks. And they did push back hard on multiple of his decisions. And because they were experts in their field and economics experts at that, they were listened to by the media and thus by the press, and thus it became an issue in the House of Commons. And thus George Osborne had to kind of pay attention to what they had to say. Reports of these committees are non-binding, but they are weighty. That is, they can't force the government to do anything, but the government would do well to listen. Now, my animation is broken. Baroness Chakrabarti is not supposed to come in at this point, but she is an example of why they can be weighty. She's a barrister, a former barrister rather, and she was director of the Civil Liberties pressure group, Liberty, between 2003 and 2016. She was made a life peer by David Cameron in 2016 during his resignation honours list, but she was from the Labour Party, which means that she was put there almost entirely for her expertise. She served under Jeremy Corbyn in the Shadow Cabinet as the Shadow Attorney General, therefore being an expert in the law. And she tends to speak in the House of Lords on civil liberties and women's rights, as you would expect someone with her unique expertise. And that's what gives the Lords weight when it comes to their reports. They know what they're talking about in a way that a politician might not. They've got more, oh, I've left the sound in. Other weightiness is Lord Winston. and no, I don't remember his first name. I have a sneaking suspicion it's Richard. He's an embryologist who pioneered IVF back in the 1960s and 70s. So he's kind of important when it comes to science and technology, in particular the biological sciences and debates on abortion. So there has been a debate on abortion in the UK political system about extending abortion and allowing abortion at different terms, different times within the term. And Winston, you would expect would weigh in, and he did. And people listened to what he had to say. When he says things like, we need to think carefully about how much we use IVF, being that he helped design the procedure, people listen. And that was the most recent news story I could find about him. He was elevated to the House of Lords in 1995, and again by a Conservative government, despite being a Labour peer. And as a consequence, you can see again, he was definitely put there for expertise. Now, I've chosen these two simply because they show expertise, not because they're Labour. I could have chosen some Conservative peers elevated onto Tony Blair. It's Tonty Blair behind this, but I couldn't find his neat pictures and information, so I went with these two. The point being they're the opposite to the party in power who appointed them as a life peer. They must be there for expertise. He's chaired the House of Lords Select Committee on Science and Technology, the permanent committee, since then. As you'd imagine, he am scientist. There are also joint committees where you get members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons working together on a particular issue. The most germane of these to our discussion is the Windrush Committee, which is debating whether or not what was done to the Windrush generation under the hostile environment of the Home Office under Theresa Human Rights for Optional May before she was Prime Minister, and whether or not that's been fixed. Because there's a lot of problems there. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. You can look it up for yourself. It is a big deal. And as a consequence, both Lords, who are experts in the field, and politicians who felt they were affected and their constituencies were affected, got together to produce a joint committee. And when a joint committee reports, you tend to have to listen. That said, we're living in a different paradigm. We're living in with a government that has a report on the Windrush generation and has so far refused to publish all of it. We know some of the recommendations. The House of Lords Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, I've already mentioned. It's used mainly by chancellors who want to check because at the end of the day, they want their budgets to go ahead. Secondary legislation, that is. And the Lords scrutinise it because the House of Commons doesn't always have time in its agenda or the days that they've got available. There might not be a debate available or the time or space to have a debate on the budget or an area of the budget that's not a huge thing. And remember, the House of Lords has no say in the budget. Only the House of Commons has that. And so what the House of Lords does is it provides scrutiny, it provides a debate that then interested parties in the House of Commons can read and understand and use as a platform for their own discussions. What else can they do? They can signal areas for development. We're not allowed to call them weaknesses in schools. And they can signify problems in advance. They can say, this is going to be an issue, deal with it. And because they mainly are experts in this area, and because it is the House of Lords, the House of Commons does well to listen, and generally speaking, does. Now, I said there were three areas. The other area is other functions. And my first words in this other functions are, well, not really. There aren't really many other functions the House of Lords serves. They're essentially a talking shop. They're unelected, so they can't legitimise anything the government does, nor can they, realistically, represent the people, for they are appointed by government. And as a consequence, they can't represent society, and they cannot represent any kind of democratic sense of representation. So what does allow them to be there? Well, it's their expertise. And their expertise often gives them roles in government. And I have some examples of Lords being brought into the cabinet, for example. The first example I have of this is one who's still there. Baron Agnew of Oulton is a Minister of State for Efficiency and Transformation. He's a former hedge fund manager. He's bought and sold companies. He's made an incredible amount of wealth. He's carefully curated his online presence. I found very little about him, which must mean that he's put in some form of legislation on that. I mean, there is legislation allowing the right to forget and the right to petition tech giants like Google not to link to certain results, and the right to get Wikipedia to remove certain sections of their biography. And I find it telling that when you look him up on Wikipedia, there's only a very short biography. He's clearly been active there. So he's a former hedge fund manager. He's a wealthy businessman with a huge personal wealth. And you could argue, therefore, he's got experience in business and experience in how business works at the higher end. He's not an economist, he's not economically trained, but he knows his stuff. And as a consequence, making him part of the government for efficiency and transformation, given that he's a hedge fund manager and he's all about asset stripping and making the most amount of money from the least amount of input, yeah, he's going to know about efficiency in a particular way. By the way, his government post is unpaid. He refused a salary. They're allowed to take one, but he decided not to take one, which, I don't know, is good. He feels he's there for the right reasons and feels he's there as an advisor as much as anything else, as an expert in his field. Now, he's the only one in the current cabinet that I can find that is a member of the House of Lords, but he's not alone. There are others. I mean, there's the leader of the House of Lords, but they have to be in the House of Lords, like the leader of the House of Commons. The next one I want to talk about is Baroness Morgan of Coates. Yes, that's Nicky Morgan, former Education Secretary, who weirdly was sacked and then went on TV news during the 2019 election explaining why Boris Johnson was a really great choice for Prime Minister, and was rewarded not long afterwards with a peerage. She was during the first government, 2019 to February 2020, the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. Yes, that's the actual name of the government department. As far as I can tell, her expertise is she supported Boris Johnson. That's it. As Education Secretary, she wasn't as bad as Gavin Williamson, but that's a pretty low bar. And in news interviews, well, you can look her up, and do look her up. I would have put several YouTube links here, but it's far more amusing to let you look her up yourselves and find out what she said on TV news at various points in her career. She's an interesting MP, and briefly held a cabinet position as a member of the House of Lords. She's still in the House of Lords. She regularly turns up for debates. But that's the thing. The debates are the most important part. Oh, my face is in the way of that. Stop the video. Goodbye, video. So what debates can do in the House of Lords is they can raise issues that are not currently being considered in the House of Commons, but whom their sponsors believe, that their sponsors believe are important. So, for example, in 2018, during the Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip and the subsequent trammeling of Palestinian rights, Lord Steele, pictured, raised a debate saying that the House of Lords took note of the plight of the Palestinians. That was it. That's all he asked for a debate. And it had an effect. The government had to respond to that. The next thing is that they can bring public opinion to bear. For example, during the EU withdrawal bill's troubled passage in 2019, the House of Lords took it upon themselves as experts in their field to essentially point out flaws with the withdrawal bill, and when amendments were not adopted, to simply defeat it time after time after time after time. Now, you could argue that was a means of bringing public opinion to the fore. The Daily Mail obviously argued differently, but yeah, they called them the House of Fools. You can read the headline for yourself. And that's really the House of Lords. That's their job. Their job is to scrutinise, their job is to provide an expert analysis, and they are highly respected in the UK political system for doing, well, just that. That's what they do in a way that most bicameral houses don't and aspire to. And they're unusual in that regard, in that they are so highly respected as experts. And so even though they're not elected, they tend to be able to do an awful lot of business, and they tend to be able to have an incredible influence on the passage of politics. Now, I am aware that this video is late being published, and that this is supposed to be an hour-long lesson, and that you'll have had to pause and move backwards and forwards in order to catch all my gabble. So I'm going to leave it here. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Have a lovely rest of the day and stay safe out there.